Today we're going to talk about speciation. Big idea, what is a species, and how can evolutionary changes in a population lead to the production of new species? Darwin himself never actually tackled this idea of the origin of species. Even though that was the title of the book, he didn't really focus on how species originated. We actually don't even have a definition of species that applies to all organisms. The definition that's used most often in biology is the biological species concept, and that's that a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring are considered species. There's many other definitions. And one of the reasons we need these is because no single definition is going to apply to all organisms. So the biological species concept applies to most populations, but it falls apart when you look at something like bacteria that reproduce asexually. So how would you define bacteria? There's a bunch of other exceptions to the species definitions. But using that definition, we come to the conclusion that speciation, this creation of new species, really means reproductive isolation. If populations can no longer reproduce with each other and produce fertile, viable offspring, viable just meaning living, then they should be considered separate species. And so then we look at the different processes that could result in that reproductive isolation. And there's two big categories for that. You have allopatric speciation, allopatric other country. And this is where a population is isolated because of some physical or geographic barrier. That barrier is just the first step. From there, with enough time and enough difference in selective pressures, populations can become reproductively isolated so that even if you brought those two populations back together, they would no longer interbreed. Sympatric speciation, on the other hand, is where you have that reproductive isolation occurring with organisms that are in contact with each other. There's no physical barrier, but there's some other factor preventing them from reproducing with each other. So try to write down some examples of factors that would cause allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Here you have a diagram that shows you some allopatric speciation. That's where the fish populations were separated by some barrier, some physical barrier. And then sympatric is where they're not separated by a barrier, but there's some other factor. It may be different predators, different population, different areas within that lake that they prefer to hunt, different food sources. This isolation doesn't always result in speciation. There are actually several factors or several outcomes that can occur. Hybrid populations can serve as genetic links between isolated populations. So if you have gene flow of some sort, those populations will remain a single species. However, if gene flow is interrupted for a period of time and those populations come back together, you have some different outcomes. If you have this loss of hybrid zone, so there's no hybrids being produced between the two isolated populations, you could have reinforcement where they no longer will interbreed, there's no hybrids being produced, and so this leads to speciation. So you're reinforcing that reproductive isolation. You could also have fusion. So when these two populations that have been isolated from each other for a long period of time start to come back together and produce hybrids, those hybrids could be successful, and you'd see those two populations once again becoming the same species. we're afraid we're seeing that now in polar bears. Polar bears are interbreeding with grizzly bears because of habitat loss, and they could theoretically become the same species again. And then you have something called stability, where you have hybrids being produced, but there's no evidence of the two species coming back together. Now let's look at some of these different barriers. So if we're talking about barriers to successful interspecies reproduction, that means that a successful reproduction would be fertile, viable offspring. We split those barriers into two separate groups. So you have prezygotic, so barriers to fertilization itself, and postzygotic is barriers after fertilization has occurred. So prezygote, postzygote. So here are some examples. Habitat isolation, so these are prezygotic. So you can have two species that are very similar living in the same area, but occupying different niches within that area. And so here you have two different species of garter snake, one that lives in the water, one that lives on land. They never get together, they don't meet up very often, and so they don't reproduce with each other. Temporal isolation. So here, even though these two species of skunk live very close to each other, one breeds during the summer and one breeds in the winter. And so they're never in the mood at the same time. Next, you have behavioral isolation. This has to do with mating rituals. Mating rituals oftentimes allow individuals to identify same species or self from non-self. So you see a lot of these really unique behavioral patterns and rituals, and these really help the females of the species or the males identify other organisms of the same species. So that's your behavioral isolation. The blue-footed booby has a particularly interesting dance that he does, and that other birds can't do that, and so that would be behavioral isolation. Now you have some prezygotic barriers that actually happen after mating is attempted. Mechanical isolation is where the anatomy, the reproductive anatomy from one species will not fit with the other. And these two very closely related species of snail, there's actually one genetic mutation that causes the swirls on their shells to be in opposite directions. And opposing whorls actually means opposing genitals, and so they don't fit together properly, and so they cannot mate. Next you have gametic isolation, and this one's interesting in that the gametes, even though they may come in contact, will not fuse, and it has to do with the proteins on the cell surface. So here you have two species of sea urchin that will both, they have external fertilization, and so they release sperm and egg into the water, same place, same time, but because they're biochemically incompatible, the sperm from one species won't fertilize the egg from the other. Next we have our postzygotic barriers. So we see barriers between species that occur after fertilization. The first is reduced hybrid viability. So even though a hybrid is produced, so two species may produce offspring, that hybrid is weak or frail. The second is reduced hybrid fertility. So even though two different species can produce hybrid offspring that are not frail, that are stronger and perfectly fine, they're sterile. And this is generally because of a mismatch in chromosome number. And so the hybrid, even though it's viable, can't produce gametes. And last but not least is hybrid breakdown. And so here, the hybrid itself is viable and fertile, but its offspring are not. So it can't continue on to a second generation. So here we're going to look at a couple of different studies of speciation that's been observed in nature and in the laboratory. See if you can figure out what's going on, what kind of species barriers are contributing to the production of new species. Here you see two different species of antelope squirrel, one found on each rim of the Grand Canyon. So here you have a geographic isolation leading to different environments and different selective agents, and now if you brought those two guys together, even though they look really similar, they would no longer be able to interbreed. Here we see hybrids being created, but these hybrids are actually not, they don't develop properly. So you have a hybrid zone. Here's your growler bear. Here's an interesting one where you see sympatric populations of two different flycatcher species are much less likely to interbreed than allopatric populations. See if you can figure out why. In this example with mosquito fish, you have two isolated populations with different levels of predation that results in different body shapes being more or less successful. But there's also mate choice preference. So females from a high predation pond will choose mates with similar body size to them. And so even if you were to bring those populations together and remove the predation pressure, you have the mate choice selecting for individuals that have similar body shape. Here you see another one where there's mate preference for flies that were raised in the same media, and so this was done in the lab. This is another interesting one. So color perception in these fish species, generally they will choose mates with similar coloring to themselves. So mate choice is contributing to this kind of sympatric speciation. So there's sexual selection going on. But with an increase in pollution in the area, we're seeing more and more hybrids being formed. And the hypothesis is that those hybrids are the result of the females not being able to identify mates with similar coloring because of the turbidity of the water. Here's an example of hybridization producing polyploid or diploid individuals. This is seen often in plant species, and these new species can be hybrids from two different plant species that came together and can produce offspring, or sometimes you'll see errors in gamete formation within the same plant species and you'll get polyploids there. So those are just some examples. Now we look at the when. There's kind of an ongoing debate about the rate of speciation. So does it happen gradually or rapidly? Gradualism, this gradual divergence of species over periods of time, is one hypothesis. The other newer theory is this idea of punctuated equilibrium, that the rate is not constant and that it consists of rapid bursts of change followed by long periods of little or no change. And we're talking about evolutionary time here. Both have evidence to support their existence, and so both are probably going on at the same time. In different species, in different circumstances, you'll have either gradualism or punctuated equilibrium occurring. And that's it for our speciation lecture. Make sure that you can do these things before you come to class, and we'll talk about some more examples of speciation and factors that contribute to it. Thanks.